everybody. Good evening, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And a huge thank you to Daniel for making this possible, but also for the spirit that you're bringing to Mark and for the spirit of collaboration across languages and disciplines. I think that's really important and so exciting. I'll echo your thanks to the Maison Française, to François Ludeman, and to Courtney Rutherford for bringing us into this beautiful space. And you should look at the photos before you leave from the current exhibition. And as I was saying to Jenny, Fellini is looking at her from behind, which I'm not quite sure what to make of that, but it's kind of awesome. And thank you, Jenny, for making the trip here. You only just set foot on these fair shores, and already we're beckoning you down to New York and putting you to work. So it's really great that you're here. So I'm just going to be very brief, say a couple of words of introduction. So Jenny works mostly on 16th century French literature, culture, and thought, and enjoys teaching across the early modern period and quite widely beyond. In her current book project, Mineral Matters, Materials, Making, and Early Modern French Literature, she is interested in how early modern writers and craftspeople contemplated the connections and tensions between poetics, craft, technique, and nature. Mineral Matters explores mineral nature cultures in writing by Rabelais, Ronsard, Léry, Montaigne, and Daubigné, alongside technical writers like the architect du roi Philibert Delorme and the ceramicist Bernard Palissy, here ici présent. She has published articles and book chapters on Rabelais' Engins, the dark ecology of poetic landscapes of the French Civil Wars, the lithic and biomimetic Montaigne, and celebrating machines in mid-16th century Lyon. In her previous work on shipwrecks, her first monograph was titled Shipwreck in French Renaissance Writing, which came out from Oxford University Press in 2019. And it's a fabulous book. I reviewed it for, I can't remember where now. French Studies. It's a really, really great book. So if you haven't read it, go read it. And so in that book, Jenny became deeply interested in the intersections between the material and the metaphorical. And she continues to think about what has been termed MATTERPHOR in this new work. So that is not a typo. She co-founded the interdisciplinary early modern network Writing Technologies and continues to enjoy collaboration with colleagues across a range of disciplines. And I don't know if you're going to tell us about that network today, but if not, go Google it. It's an incredibly fabulous thing with people from many institutions working on some really interesting topics that are related to today's talk. Before taking up her current post as assistant professor of Romance languages and literatures at Harvard, she held teaching and research fellowships at the University of Oxford. So please put your hands together and let's welcome Jenny.
Thank you so much, Philip, and thank you for the introduction, but also the invitation, and thank you, Eugenio, as well, and to the Maison Française and Courtney for your fantastic work in making all this run so smoothly, and for your warm welcome. And thank you all for being here tonight. I'm so excited to have this opportunity to share my current research with you and hear your feedback on it as it takes shape. So my title speaks to the kind of work I'm doing in two ways, at least. I'm interested in the material, ecological, and cultural interface of early modern craft. In my talk tonight, I'll be discussing these crafting ecologies, then, the entangled and non-human agencies and qualities that come together in what Jeffrey Jerome Cohen has called anxious collaboration. I'm interested in digging deeper into that anxiety and expanding something like a spectrum of anxieties, but also curiosities that come to the fore when we examine craft. Craft and technique can be dangerous, polluting activities and can highlight human vulnerability, but can also, for example, entail the development of quite sophisticated prosthetic hands for soldiers injured in battle, as by the royal surgeon Ambroise Paré. Jane Bennett speaks of an intricate dance that has always been performed between humanity and non-humanity. More morbid sounding, perhaps, Timothy Morton describes the dark ecologies that enfold everything: cars, pollution, melting ice caps and all, refusing pure or green constructions of nature with a capital N. And here we come to the second sense of my title. In this work, I'm not only investigating ecologies of craft, but in a sense crafting ecologies, elaborating and adapting ecological models from the early modern materials I'm working with. And perhaps No one better embodies this notion of crafting ecologies than the 16th century ceramicist and geological theorist Bernard Palissy. And as Philip already pointed out, the image I've chosen to open this talk with is a detail from one of his oval platters, dating from around 1580, and now held in the Louvre, although there is a slightly similar one in the Met, as I discovered on Saturday. Palissy was a Huguenot artisan, as I probably don't need to tell you, who first trained as a glass painter, like his father, but was then exposed to other craft forms through the crafting ecologies of artisanal workshops of the period, in the Tuileries, in the Louvre, in fact. And he found this element there, ceramics. He's perhaps most famous for these platters, which were imitated in his own time and beyond, and for pioneering a technique for making them, live casting animals, a technique already used by metal workers in the period. So he would apparently keep live fish, reptiles, and amphibians in his workshop. And when the moment came, he would take plaster molds of them, suffocating them in the process. From the plaster molds, ceramic casts could then be made, producing fossil-like but lively forms to be arranged into these teeming displays that mimic and somehow exaggerate natural watery ecologies, while also, as the fittingly named historian of art Hannah Rose Shell has pointed out, alluding to his conception of the Earth's own generation of mineral, vegetable, and animal objects. Palissy's ceramic practice allowed him to fuse his observation of animal, vegetable, and mineral nature with the brilliance of his artistry, creating a hybrid of nature and culture, liveliness and artifice. As we'll see later, he became quite obsessed with the idea of the join between the two becoming invisible. As such, then, he emblematizes the interface and ecology between natural materials and human crafting skill that's the focus of my current work. Mud, also in my title, is another kind of interface between solid and liquid, stone and water, the mineral and the biological. And on my way here, reading on the Amtrak down from Boston, I found that Donna Haraway has already considered mud in ways that resonate with what I'm interested in here. In Staying with the Trouble, she writes of a way to think with a host of companions in sympoetic threading, that's making together, sympoetic threading, felting, tangling, tracking, and sorting, and material semiotic composting as theory in the mud, as muddle. And Philip mentioned the network earlier, the Writing Technologies Network, and right from the beginning of that, we're a kind of motley crew of people from different institutions and disciplines, and I started referring to our meetings as like a compost heap where we would bring things to add layers, and over time they kind of mature into something more complex and interesting. So this material semiotic composting, the imbrication of the material with the metaphorical, is also, I think, a helpful way of understanding another term in my title, MATTERPHOR, which I first came across through Lowell Duckett, who it seems coined it in 2013 in the conference on elemental eco-criticism that led to his co-edited volume with Jeffrey Jerome Cohen. MATTERPHOR, writes Duckett with Cohen here, is a tropic material coil, word and substance together transported, of language, but not reducible to linguistic terms, agentic and thick. So while muddiness and the muddledness are often what we strive to avoid in our thinking and writing, in my project, the mud is often where the metaphor is, and this kind of interface, I think, is where the most interesting stuff is happening. So this book project, Mineral Matters, Materials Making an Early Modern French Literature, in this project, I'm investigating what roles the mineral played in early modern culture, how pluri or pre-disciplinary, in the modern sense that we're familiar with, early modern writers and craftspeople wielded their embodied knowledge, experience of the materials they worked with, how ancient myths about magnets, torture devices, or mongooses coating themselves in an armor of dried mud became newly and strangely relevant in an era marked in France, as you will hardly need reminding, by civil wars fueled by gunpowder. I argue that a focus on the mineral might lead to a better understanding of early modern thinking about humans' place within nature, and open up new or forgotten perspectives on our own ecological crises today. Why the mineral in particular? Because it's the raw material of the crafts that the book is structured around, but also because of how this notionally and sort of emblematically inert matter is so often tied to affective and gendered questions, and because of how the mineral opens up perspectives on a geological timescale, encouraging radically different perspectives and thinking. Mineral matters then also contributes to the geologic turn in literary and cultural studies. Philip Asher's own recent book, Exterranean, highlights extraction and not only emissions, on which much recent attention has focused, as foundational to ecological catastrophe. Mineral matters, as I'm conceiving of it, takes as its central focus the human cultures of invention and fabrication, in which non-human elements, minerals, play a surprisingly active role. Elemental literary and geographical studies by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen and Catherine Youssef have demonstrated, respectively, the vital relation of geology to the making of literature and to racializing colonial logics of extraction and the slave trade, and we'll see more on that shortly. So they're paying close attention to the blurry or maybe muddy borders between metaphor and materiality. My objective is to uncover what the mineral can tell us about 16th century understandings of the inseparability of nature and culture or artifice that were lost or occluded in later centuries. The book asks, or will ask, I hope, how does early modern attention to mineral vitality shape and reflect conceptions of the human in the period? What happens when mythology and commonplace cultural ideas about the mineral meet with material reality? And what is the role of craft in mediating these material and cultural forms of understanding? So I'll try to give some answers to these questions at the end of my talk. This project takes a really capacious view of craft, as adopted, for example, by Richard Sennett via Plato. In Sennett's book, The Craftsman, Plato traced skill back to the root word for making, poiein, which is in Haraway's Sympoiesis as well. This is the parent word for poetry, and in the Homeric hymn to the master god of craftsmen Hephaestus, too, poets appear as just another kind of craftsman. But in his own time, Plato observed that although craftsmen are all poets, they're not called poets, they have other names. Plato worried that these different names and indeed different skills kept people in his day from understanding what they shared. So it's that importance of understanding what crafts have in common, as well as the distinctiveness of different artisanal techniques. I'm thinking of Isabelle Stonger's notion of the ecology of practices, sort of not wanting to flatten everything down and make it all analogous. But it's this understanding of the commonality as well as the difference that underpins my project. Jane Bennett, in her influential work, Vibrant Matter, whose cover I can never resist showing, it's just such a great image, discusses the craftsperson's understanding of the falseness of any sharp distinction between form and matter, referred to by philosophers following Gilbert Simondon as the hylomorphic model. So according to this model, a presumably passive, unorganized, or raw matter can be given organic form only by the agency of something that is not itself material. Instead of a formative power detachable from matter, artisans and mechanics, cooks, builders, cleaners, anyone else intimate with things, encounter a creative materiality with incipient tendencies and propensities, which are variably enacted depending on the other forces, affects, or bodies with which they come into close contact. So the Mineral Matters project understands writers as artisans too. And for example, in an article published last year in Montaigne Studies on lithic Montaigne, one of the things I argue is that Montaigne's writing itself pushes against that kind of form-content distinction, even as he makes falsely modest claims of his own artlessness. Secondly, I push Bennett's point here on craft further, since I'm interested not only in the co-relation of form and content, but on the co-forming of craftsperson and their material through the repetition of experience, or in Montaigne's words, je n'ai plus fait mon livre que mon livre m'a fait. To give you a sense of where what I talk about tonight kind of fits in the bigger project, the book will have 6 chapters, each centering on a process, object, or material through which the non-human mineral and the human, as both mind and body, head and hand, enter into this anxious collaboration. We have armor making, fortification, millstones, plows, ceramics, and dye and ink, all intersecting with the craft of writing, printing, and the forging of fictions. Its 3 parts operate at decreasing scales from the macro to the micro, from rock and ore to grain to powder, and attending in turn to processes, objects, and materials. Armour making and fortification imbricated in a feedback loop of technological advances driven by the demands of military conflict form the basis of chapters 1 and 2. An ambivalence towards that term forging in Montaigne and the subtle malignity, the maligne subtilité, of military engineers in Rabelais point to the powerful influence of the pessimistic mythical idea of the age of iron, a fallen state of humanity, depending on toil and prone to violence and conflict, while at the same time, attention to the mineral realities of craft and its context call into question the unnaturalness of war. On a more granular scale, attending to the agricultural occupations of ploughing and milling, chapters 3 and 4 of the monograph, tightly linked to war through the importance of landscape and fertility or infertility in the imaginary of the age of iron. With the creation of the iron plough a key symbol of humans' corruption, both in ancient narratives and their early modern retellings. The project begins to interrogate and disrupt the distinction between military and domestic spheres. Dark ecologies of fertility and destruction abound, from the uncanny genesis of enemy soldiers springing from the earth to the bodies of defeated combatants clogging the course of a watermill. And minerals in their finest forms have no less strong nor complex agency as chapters 5 and 6 on dyeing and pottery show. From the role of salts and metals in ancient ceramic techniques to the latest imported dyes and pigments from newly discovered lands, attention to the mineral reveals the temporal and geographical entanglements of early modern crafting cultures. The microscale also brings animal and vegetable agencies into closer range. Well, the Calvinist missionary Jean de Lery mobilizes writing in Brazil with ink as a mark of both the authenticity of his testimony and less directly of the closeness of the indigenous Tupi people to nature. This latter claim is of the order of those used to justify the exploitation and enslavement of the Tupi, who were put to work in the place of beasts of burden and worse, in particular by colonists seeking out the mineral riches of their lands. I'm drawing here on the work of Sarika Davis in her book on Renaissance ethnography and the invention of the human. In an incisive critique of the predominant tendency of the non-human turn, as we may call it, and discourse around the Anthropocene, to neglect the questions of race and coloniality entwined with geology, Catherine Youssef writes, the human and its subcategory, the inhuman, are historically relational to a discourse of settler colonial rights and the material practices of extraction. That is, racialization belongs to a material categorization of the division of matter, corporeal and mineralogical, into active and inert. Extractable matter must be both passive, awaiting extraction and possessing of properties, and able to be activated through the mastery of white knowledge. These historic geologic relations and geologics span Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia through the movement of people, objects, and racial and material categories. We see this geologic playing out already in the depiction of the non-human landscape and human bodies in maps of the Renaissance period, as in the 1555 Cosmographie universelle of Guillaume Le Tétu, here. In Le Tétu's portrayal of the Americas, each page is accompanied by an explanatory note, listing the natural resources abounding in each territory. In La Nouvelle Espagne, New Spain, he shows the hierarchized division of labor between, we have on the right, a dark-skinned, likely African man toiling at the rock face, and the Europeans working with the metal derived from the metals and ores he's digging up. So if I go back, you can see how they're in the same landscape, but kind of hierarchized visually, even on the page. Elsewhere, we see another kind of mining scene, where I think visually we even have the bodies of the indigenous diggers, miners, being kind of visually analogized with the surface of the mineral earth. And you get a clearer sense, of course, of the forcedness of the labor that's going on here. Mineral Matters then examines analogies and entanglements between human and non-human bodies in the early modern period, mineral nature cultures, to adopt Donna Haraway's term, in France, and as we've seen here, beyond. As the book traces the competing agencies of raw minerals and myth or commonplace, I want to develop the idea of mineralized thinking. And this is something conceived by analogy with Steve Mentz's classification in his book Shipwreck Modernity of wet and dry shipwreck texts, respectively. So the wet ones bear the marks of contact with real life seafaring, and the dry ones are more shaped, or more clearly shaped, by inherited cultural notions and commonplaces. I should make it clear though as well that you can have a wet text that kind of dries out, so it's not a strict binary. It's a really interesting one, and I've been teaching with it this semester. In the context of French criticism, this could be seen to align with the distinction between the effet de réel, the reality effect, and the effet du réel, the impact of the real. Far from implying any negative sense of petrified or ossified thinking, mineralized thinking refers to the subtle wielding of embodied knowledge of the mineral, exemplified by the royal architect Philibert Delorme in his Premier Tome d'Architecture, when he writes that experienced stonemasons seeing his diagrams will not need the verbal explanations it provides. Their hands will already know what to do. Je crois merveilleusement que ceci ne soit trouvé fâcheux et malaisé d'entendre à ceux qui ne sont point de l'art. En quoi ils me supporteront s'il leur plaît, car nous l'écrivons principalement pour les tailleurs de pierre et maîtres maçons, entre lesquels se trouveront quelques-uns qui comprennent incontinent l'artifice, voire sans aucune démonstration. Prenons le compas à la main et le dresseront incontinent sur les lignes propres et convenables. Okay, so there's almost a bypassing of the head, and the hand knows immediately what to do. And these kinds of distinctions obviously relate to age-old oppositions between theory and practice in literary and other artisanal modes of writing. Palissy personifies these concepts in dialogue form in his Discours admirable de la nature des eaux et fontaines, tant naturelles qu'artificielles, des métaux, des sels et salines, des pierres, des terres, du feu et des émaux, etc. It's a long title. While we might expect the craftsman to favor pratique over théorique, Palissy's dialogue demonstrates the balance or synergy to be found between the two. And the kind of more literary side of things, Rabelais and Montaigne are particularly striking examples of mineralized thinking, demonstrating rich and sensitive attention to the material and the sensory, excavating and revitalizing familiar mineral myths and commonplaces. So I think here we get a sense of this interface idea between working with the mineral and working with mineral myth and commonplace. How did I come to be working on these entanglements? I thought I'd give a bit of a sense of how this kind of emerges from the shipwreck work. So while I was finishing up my doctoral work that would lead to that book, I was noticing more and more how early modern authors were couching shipwreck in elemental and ecological terms, often as a punishment for transgression of natural boundaries, taking to the seas instead of remaining on terra firma. The Pléiade poet, Pierre de Ronsard, laments the cutting down of trees in his local forest for shipbuilding, which he associates with greedy pillaging of the New World, as has been beautifully explored by Louisa Mackenzie in their book, The Poetry of Place. And as I was making the transition from thesis to book, Steve Mentz's fabulous Shipwreck Modernity was published, giving me both a heart attack and a huge amount of inspiration as I started to see what could be done with shipwreck and ecological approaches. But it was also Josiah Blackmore's Manifest Perdition, which was really formative during my doctoral studies, that pointed me to the colonial materialities of seafaring and shipwreck. And in my new project, I continued to think hard about the dark ecologies of the Americas under colonial invasion, attending to the natural mineral resources and their exploitation, in tandem with the exploitation of indigenous and later Black bodies, through reading early modern materials and maps with the work of Sarika Davies on the role of early modern maps in the invention of the human, and Catherine Yusof on geology and race. A pivotal text for thinking about those landscape anxieties is the treatise of the miner and metallurgist Georg Agricola, who anticipates in the prologue to his treatise on metals the kind of objections that will be levelled at him and his occupation. The earth, these critics will say, does not conceal and remove from our eyes things which are useful and necessary to mankind, but on the contrary, like a beneficent and kindly mother, she yields in large abundance from her bounty, and brings into the light of day the herbs, vegetables, grains, and fruits, and the trees. The minerals, on the other hand, she buries far beneath in the depths of the ground. Therefore, they should not be sought. But they are dug out by wicked men, who, as the poets say, are the products of the Iron Age. Ovid censures their audacity in the following lines. And not only was the rich soil required to furnish corn and due sustenance, but men even descended into the entrails of the earth, and they dug up riches, those incentives to vice, which the earth had hidden and removed to the Stygian shades. Then destructive iron came forth, and gold, more destructive than iron. Then war came forth. I like that sense there, that the metal seems very kind of agentive. And as we see from the illustration from Agricola here, another cause for early modern deforestation is the massive expansion of mining. So I've gone from cutting down trees to build ships, to cutting down trees to get to the iron and the metals. It was striking to me when I first encountered this text to find poetry and myth quoted in a metallurgical treatise. And it speaks of the strong invocation of the mythological cultural reference points in technical discourse, just as in the literary sources I work with. These narratives of a descent from an Eden-like age of gold to an age of iron, of toil and tools, will be one of the threads or veins of myth that run through the book. Agricola goes on to defend mining as less unnatural than the plundering of the seas. The earth is the proper element of the human, and so he aligns himself with those elemental critics of seafaring that I mentioned before. There's a funny loop there through Agricola back to shipwrecks. But back to mineral matters and to how these crafting ecologies are elaborated in the literary texts I work with. In his fourth book, as the traveling Pantagrueliste land on the island of Gasta, a stomach god representing hunger of all kinds and described as the master or inventor of all arts, that is, technique or crafts, Rabelais stages a history of the evolution of human crafting cultures, a retelling of the fall from the age of gold to the age of iron, from Ovid or Hesiod. Here's Gasta in a 19th century illustration. In fact, in the text, he is importantly without ears, which Doré obviously missed, but you get a sense of his kind of monstrous embodiment here. So here's the history of Gasta's invention. Dès le commencement, il inventa l'art fabril et agriculture pour cultiver la terre, tendant afin qu'elle lui produit grain. Il inventa l'art militaire et armes pour grain défendre, médecine et astrologie avec les mathématiques nécessaires pour grain en sûreté par plusieurs siècles gardés. Il inventa les moulins à eau, avant, après, à autres 1000 engins, pour grain moudre et réduire en farine. Le levain pour faire monter la pâte, le sel pour lui donner saveur, le feu pour le cuire, les horloges et cadrans pour entendre le temps de la cuite de pain, créature de grain. So we can already see how agriculture and military technologies are interlinked in the mythological imagination. This sense of a kind of feedback loop of crafting by which one invention begets another anticipates contemporary theories of human entanglement with things, and in particular, I think, here of the work of Ian Hodder, who writes, there is a darker side to the entanglements of humans and things that is often missed in things like actor network theory. A key aspect of our relationships with stuff is that they involve more than networks of humans and things, a symmetry of relations. Rather, our relations with things are often asymmetrical, leading to entrapments, in particular pathways from which it is difficult to escape. So this is as part of an article where he's arguing that once we started making stuff, the stuff needed more stuff to fix it or to support it or embellish it, and we kind of get into this snowball of stuff. The proliferation of Gasta's arts figure just such a pathway. Their spiraling course developing a sense of inevitability through a kind of dialectical immune response, if you like, a literal arms race. So the passage continues. Il inventa art et moyen de battre et de démolir forteresses et châteaux par machines et tourments béliers, balises, catapultes, desquels il nous montra la figure assez mal entendue des ingénieux architectes disciples de Vitruve, comme nous a confessé Messire Philibert Delorme. Turns out they may have known each other. Lesquels, comme plus n'en profiter, obstant la maligne subtilité et subtile malignité du fortificateur, il avait inventé récemment canon, serpentine, coulevrine, bombarde, basilic, jetant boulets de fer de plomb de bronze, pesant plus que grosse enclume, moyennant une composition de poudre horrifique, de laquelle nature même s'est ébahie. Et s'est confessé vaincu par art. Car plus c'est horrible, plus c'est épouvantable, plus diabolique, et plus de gens meurtris, cassent, rompent et tuent, plus étonnent les sens des humains, plus de murailles démolies un coup de basilic que ne ferait 100 coups de foudre. The boundary between nature and artifice or craft is being tested here. In the description of the military inventions of Gaster, there is a marked and important shift in the moral framing of technological invention. It's significant that the narrator, Alcofreba, does not at first distance himself from this potentially suspect field of knowledge, declaring on the contrary his connection and communication with that expert architect, Philippe Adelon. But by the end of the inventory, curiosity turns to horror with the invention of gunpowder, de laquelle nature même s'est ébahie. In the course of the list, then, a kind of Rubicon is crossed, with the insistent repetition of plus, speaking of transgression. It's difficult to determine the precise point at which this moral reversal occurs, but by the time we get to gunpowder, the poudre horrifique, the tone is unmistakable. Imitatio, the imitation of nature here, has run amok, as the attempt to replicate nature through the biomimetic naming of weaponry after animals, which I've highlighted here. Okay, so these are all the guns that are named after different kinds of birds and snakes. An attempt to reclaim artificial bodies as a part of nature threatens to carry away the inventor entirely. The development of the Gaster episode suggests that all inventions, though they're typically considered artificial, stem from a natural impulse. Paradoxically, nature is finally exceeded, outstripped, ébahie. Rabelais' exploratory and celebratory listing of technologies serves to challenge the divide between nature and culture. Invention and engineering prove to be double-edged gifts, furnishing the means for both creation and destruction. Like another of Gaster's inventions, the bullets stopped in their tracks by his ingenious magnetic device, the technologies elaborated in this chapter hover in an ambivalent state between the possible and the impossible, and between the morally excusable and the diabolique. So it is that Gaster's Island begins to evoke Pandora's box and speaks of an anxiety around invention that remains, I think, unresolved in Rabelais' work. And it's an anxiety picked up a few decades later by Michel de Montaigne in the essay, composed from the 1570s onwards, and especially in by far his longest chapter, which we were just talking about earlier this afternoon, the Apologie d'un amant second, in which he spends some 30 or 40 pages discussing the vanity of the human and denying human superiority over other animals, including through an investigation of various animals' natural, physical, and intellectual forms of defense and weaponry. Which brings us more squarely to armor making and biomimesis. Like Rabelais, Montaigne is drawn to the biomimetic strategies of armorers. He admiringly lists examples of ancient Scythian armor, so finely wrought in the form of feathers that the wearer was unencumbered. Elsewhere, horses, technologized in warfare, are clad in leather plates, with the soldiers on them coming to resemble hommes de fer, iron men, so well are they covered by their armor. The language of making, threaded through Montaigne's exploration of artifice and craft in the Apologie, centers on notions of fiction and forger, both used with a lot of ambivalence. Forger, forging, is both what human philosophers do when inventing mechanisms by which to explain nature, very negatively inflected in Montaigne, and in a kind of relativizing of that dynamic, it's also what Montaigne claims animals would do to create a god in their own image. So it's distinctly a human flaw, and yet kind of recuperated by the realm of the non-human. So he introduces a second, strangely inverted kind of biomimesis, by which animals, drawn from often mythic apocryphal accounts from Pliny the Elder and Plutarch, come to practice crafts that seem almost imitative of and often superior to their human counterparts. Kind of familiar tropes of spider weavers and bird architects put human craft to shame in what are familiar topoi. But a cluster of anecdotes about the remarkable tactile care and craft of elephants moves us firmly beyond commonplace ideas. Elephants are described as tending to soldiers' wounds, as demonstrating science and dignity, and offer proof of the naturalness of bodily fortification. Et l'industrie de fortifier le corps et le couvrir par moyens acquis nous l'avons par un instinct et précepte naturel. Qu'il soit ainsi, l'éléphant aiguise et émoue ses dents, desquelles il se sert à la guerre, car il en a de particulières pour cet usage qu'il épargne et ne les emploie aucunement à ses autres services. Thanks to the elephant's exceptional deftness, what begins as a concessive move admitting certain ways in which the human animal does appear superior to others, pivots to a catalogue of bodily skill that undermines that kind of a distinction. In a detail I find telling, when we examine the Exemplaire de Bordeaux, the copy of the essay annotated by Montaigne for corrections in the subsequent edition, we see the earlier edition terms these bodily supplements étrangers, foreign, or strange, but that in Montaigne's own refinement and polishing of his text, he preferred the more neutral, active, acquired. This kind of industrie or skill, and especially the materials used in practicing it, is thus brought back in touch with nature, a dynamic that's prolonged as the passage continues. Quand les taureaux vont au combat, ils répandent et jettent la poussière alentour d'eux. Les sangliers affinent leur défense, et l'ignomant, quand il doit venir aux prises avec le crocodile, l'unissent encore l'enduit et le croûte, tout alentour de limon, bien serré et bien pétri, comme d'une cuirasse. Pourquoi ne dirons-nous qu'il est aussi naturel armé de bois et de fer? This naturalizing of art through the crafts of elephants and the mongoose harks back to medieval notions of natura artifex, nature as artificer, illustrated here with nature as a blacksmith in two images from the Roman de la Rose, one from Britain and one from the US. There we go. And the naturalizing of art is extended to Montaigne's own writing craft, notably and mischievously perhaps, as he refers to his writings as just another form of excretion. Ce sont ici des excréments d'un vieil esprit, dur tantôt, tantôt lâche, et toujours indigeste. Kind of extreme version of the modesty topos, I think, here. Elsewhere, even in less extreme versions of that topos, Montaigne's account of the intertwined practices of reading and writing remain insistently corporeal and tactile. Quoi, si je prête un peu plus attentivement l'oreille au livre, depuis que je guette, si j'en pourrais friponner quelque chose de quoi émailler ou étayer le mien, je n'ai aucunement étudié pour faire un livre, mais j'ai aucunement étudié pour ce que je l'avais fait. Si c'est aucunement étudié, que effleuré et pincé par la tête ou par les pieds, tantôt un auteur, tantôt un autre. Nullement pour former mes opinions, oui pour les assister, pièces à former, seconder et servir. It's because of this immense tactility, this sensitivity to texture and materiality, that for me Montaigne is such an illustrative example of the mineralized mind. And perhaps I can talk about that more in the Q&A, about the specificities of his engagement with mineral textures. Montaigne is also concerned, though, with that capacious Platonic conception of poetry that we saw earlier, though he addresses it in a typically twisting and ambiguous passage. In the Apologie, amid a general critique of philosophy's rigidly systematic ways of thinking, and thus failed attempts to adequately account for nature, he writes, « Et j'ai pas vu en Platon ce divin mot, que nature n'est rien qu'une poésie énigmatique, comme peut-être qui dirait une peinture voilée et ténébreuse, entreluisant d'une infinie variété de faux jours à exercer nos conjectures. » And the English translation of the Latin here. All those things lie hidden and enveloped in such thick shadows that no human genius is keen enough to be able to penetrate into heaven or descend into the earth. Et certes, la philosophie n'est qu'une poésie sophistiquée. D'où tirent à ces auteurs anciens toutes leurs autorités que des poètes. Et les premiers furent poètes eux-mêmes, et les traitèrent en leur art. Platon n'est qu'un poète décousu. Such a great quote. In the very moment, he seems to want to use the status of a poet as a humbling comparison with the philosophers. His latent poetic streak makes itself known through his paisley imagery. Though he laments his lack of poetic talent, Montaigne is a great appreciator and prolific quoter of verse throughout the essay. And it seems to me here that poetry for him is aligned with the fiction légitime, the legitimate fictions that he argues allow human culture to function. So as a lawyer, he's interested in the concept of a legitimate fiction. Finally, then, let's return to the ceramics of Bernard Palissy and the strange, perhaps rather lumpen poetry, of his texts. For Palissy, as much an artisan as a geological expert of earth and minerals, his work with earth through ceramics was a way to synthesize art and nature. As this image from one of his ceramic platters shows us, shells figure as especially important mineral bodies in Palissy's work. He actually writes that while walking along the sea, one day he was inspired by the shape of a snail shell, a murex shell, which is interesting in its own right, which he then set about imitating in his architectural plans for an ideal fortress. So I love that he's tapping into these kind of Fibonacci sequences and the maths of nature. As Noam Andrews has shown, Palissy's description in his Recette véritable of 9 imaginary cabinets or grottos offers a monument to Palissy's stunning artistic capacities. Palissy hybridizes disciplines. Through his grottos, quote, knowledge is meant to be intuited from experience, just as Palissy himself came to understand nature through patience and close observation. To walk through the garden, to observe the cabinets in sequence, is to become witness to the sum total expression of Palissy's artisanal epistemology. So let's walk through one of the cabinets with Palissy. Le premier cabinet, je le bâtirai de briques cuites, formées de telle sorte que le dit cabinet se trouvera ressembler la forme d'un rocher qu'on aurait creusé sur le lui-même. Le dehors du dit cabinet sera maçonné de grosses pierres de rocher, sans être poli, ni incise, afin que le dehors du dit cabinet n'ait en soi aucune forme de bâtiment. Fascinating kind of erasure of the artifice here. Et en maçonnant le dehors du dit cabinet, which is what I mean by his lumpen poetry, it's quite repetitive, j'amènerai un canal d'eau en telle sorte que le dit cabinet ressemblant à un rocher, on pensera que les dites fissures sortent du dit cabinet, excusez-moi, sans aucun artifice. Et quand le cabinet sera maçonné, je le viendrai couvrir de plusieurs couleurs d'émail coiffé, je viendrai faire un grand feu dedans le cabinet subit, et ce jusqu'à temps que les dits émails soient fondus ou liquéfiés sur les dites maçonneries. Ainsi, les émails en se liquéfiant couleront, et en se coulant, s'entremêleront, et en s'entremêlant, ils feront des figures et idées fort plaisantes. Et on trouvera que les dix émails auront couvert la jointure des briques, en telle sorte que le dit cabinet semblera par le dedans être tout d'une pièce, parce qu'il n'y aura aucune apparition des jointures, et si sera le dit cabinet luisant d'un tel polissement que les lisières et l'engrotte qui entreront dedans se verront comme en un miroir. And I love that ending image of the animals seeing themselves reflected in the shiny surface of the enamel, just as their forms find reflection in Palissy's other ceramics. Reading this description, even in my abridged version, we might feel we're actually finally experiencing what geological time feels like. It kind of takes a long time to get anywhere. And yet, although he's clearly a geologist ceramicist and not a poet in the strictest sense, in the passage on the enameling here, the undeniably liquid flow of his sentence, with its polyptoton of future tenses and present participles, the way the verbs kind of circle back, double up, and move forward, figures the texture and the movement of the materials he's so familiar with manipulating. So to wrap things up, I'll return to my questions as promised. How does the early modern period, how does early modern attention to mineral vitality shape and reflect conceptions of the human in the period? As we've seen in the defense of mining by Agricola, the mineral realm is bound up in the elemental definition of the human. In Montaigne, it serves to blur and question the distinction between humans and other animals. In Palissy, notions of an organic, generative earth underpin the hybridization of craft and nature. What happens when mythology and commonplace cultural ideas about the mineral meet material reality? As we saw in Rabelais, the mythological imagination meets mineral reality in the form of cutting-edge craft and technique, in a troubling interaction distinctively realized by Rabelais' mineralized mind. And as for the role in crafting, in mediating these material and cultural forms of understanding. It's both through the particularity of individual crafting contexts and through a generalized conception of craft that we can gain, I think, a richer and better attuned understanding of the hybrid natural cultural ecologies in which we are all entangled. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Absolutely, absolutely fantastic and incredibly rich presentation. So, will you be taking questions?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Shall I let you do that? Okay.
I don't know if there's a question or a comment. I'll start by saying I don't know if there's a question or a comment, which is a terrible way to start a question. But, I guess I'm struck by Palissy's use, as you stated, the way he creates these forms, right, is by killing the animal. So in the one sense, it's this beautiful sort of rendition of living forms from mineral substances, but to do so requires killing killing them. And so I'm curious if there is any sort of self-reflection about this, right? Like, is there a sort of yeah, like, was there any sort of discussion or acknowledgement of the irony of this?
Yeah, it's something I have an issue with as a vegetarian, if nothing else. I find this stuff so compelling, and yet there is that, and I wanted that to be clear, that it's bound up. It's a dark ecology, if you like. I think for Palissy, how I would think that he understands it is essentially in the sense that his project is one of expounding God's plan in nature, God's creation, and in that cosmology, the human is the divinely inspired creation, right? So all of this is for humans to better become closer to God. So I think that's how he would square it, but I don't know that he explicitly addresses it. I'd love to figure out if he does. Yeah, I should keep thinking about that as he thinks about the kind of spontaneous generation idea. I think that would be another thing to understand, that the kinds of creatures that he's killing, he still sort of understands as being of such a low order that they are essentially almost mud themselves. And so I think he might feel differently about killing a bird or a mammal, as we would now call it. But yeah, it's a knotty problem. Thank you.
So I've got lots of questions, so I'm going to try and not jump through all of them, but let's see. I'm going to ask a question about something I know nothing about, because about armor, which is, so the first thing, your talk really brought out how close armor is to the kind of things that Palissy is doing, which I'd never really thought about before, which is to say the empty, right, and the empty of whatever was living in it before them, which really struck me at the, and I was talking about this to you earlier, but the exhibition that was at the Musée de l'Armée at the Invalides in Paris last year, which was an exhibition that was trying to tell the story of the wars of religion by looking at the people who were participating in it, and particularly the exhibition was organized around the museum's own collection of armor. So it was a little bit random in terms of like who was being represented and stuff. But the thing that really struck me in going to that exhibit was, armor in a museum is obviously there's no one inside it, right? So it has to be held up. It has to be artificially, kept in the right position, kind of thing. There are no legs coming out. It's not connected to any kind of terrestrial space, or it's completely delocalized, completely detached from everything. And so, I guess the question has to do with this, the emptiness, both of the shells, but also of the armor, and what comes to fill that, or how it comes to fill that. And I think the same sort of question was also coming up for me with, what was it now? I don't remember now. Again with the what you said about Delorme, And so when Delorme is saying, the hand knows what to do, of the mason, that's true if you're in 16th century France, right? But it's not true now in the sense of like we've forgotten. And so I'm thinking of, Pamela Smith's work up at Columbia, which is really fascinating, trying to recreate these techniques, but all we have to do it are the texts. So it's the complete opposite of Delorme. So I guess the question somewhere in there has to do with the role of emptiness within connection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Thank you for tracing that connection with the Making and Knowing project, which is just incredible, and raises all these questions around how do we, as it were, get to the object or the process through only the text. Empty shells. Wow. The first thing I'd say, which is not really an answer to your question, but I just love how Palissy describes that shells are kind of made from this. He thinks about the interface of the body of the mollusk effectively with the shell. So he understands that the shell is built from their saliva, which is, you can see it, right? They're formed in a kind of sedimentary way. You can see rings on shells, so he's kind of not wrong. So that's just in itself a kind of amazing. And just to use the word saliva about mollusks is just great. The emptiness of the armor. I suppose it's for Montaigne, it would be probably interesting that the animal armor can't really be empty except when the animal's dead, right? Because it's always attached unless you're a hermit crab. So there's something there about the self and the kind of carapace being always very sensitively kind of articulated. But then he does have this mongoose, which, it's like a just so story, the mongoose kind of cladding itself in mud as well. But yeah, I really take your point about the fact that the human armor needs the body to kind of articulate it and make sense of it. I'm sure I'll probably end up emailing you tomorrow with more thoughts about emptiness. And on Delorme, I just finished a chapter on him where I'm thinking precisely about the kind of back and forth between making stuff and then drawing it and writing about it. And his work doesn't make sense without those three poles, if you like. You need the diagram and the description and the physical thing to get the full understanding of how he's working between the abstract and the material and the particular. So I think there's this kind of conversation happening between those three things. So maybe that's a way out of the emptiness in a way. But it's true that what you're left with the text is a sense of the missingness of the stones. It's the absence of the actual work and only the drawing or the description, which always does feel like a kind of, we're missing something. Yeah. But thank you, that's such a nice way to draw all that together. Sorry, I'm not looking up.
Thank you so much. Actually, going to the emptiness question, and actually at Mark pre-pandemic, there was a conference and there were some beautiful illustrations of prosthetics from various museums, small ones. And what struck me there was that the prosthetics, which were made by the armorers who had made the gauntlets, etc., they had hands that were metallic and moved and hinged incredibly. So the actual reason they disappeared and are only coming back now was the interface of flesh and the prosthetic, which of course got infected, and no amount of craft and ingeniousness and beauty actually could fill that gap. Finally. So I was thinking of the emptiness there where something is made, but it will be empty. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I saw you nodding about the
Yeah, yeah.
and the that prosthetic hand, which is so remarkable. I know if anyone does Google the writing technologies group, that's the image we have as our kind of emblem. So there's
Really?
in his traité, I think there are two hands, and one of them looks like a flesh hand, if you like. It seems like an accurate drawing of a hand, so it's perhaps a wooden prosthetic. And the other one is articulated, seems to be metal, and I think is holding a plume, right? So it's also that the hand is this very human thing in the kind of Aristotelian sense, right? It's the hand that distinguishes us. And so writing seems like a nice reduction of that kind of concept. And I haven't thought much about that kind of painful interface. So thank you. Yeah.
I was thinking with the shells, and if it's alive in there, and so the saliva is also disinfecting the connection.
True. And I've just seen something doing the rounds on the internet about how ancient Persian cultures, I think it's Persian, used to put frogs in milk because the frogs generate something that actually slightly sterilizes things. So it would be good for preserving. So now I'm thinking about all the goo. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you. This was really fascinating. A couple of things. You sort of at some point you mentioned at different points in the talk two things which really sort of rang a bell to me coming to this sort of topic, which is very sort of different from what I normally do, but coming to it from the perspective of classical reception, which is what I do. And you have been talking about this mineral vitality. You made a point about you mentioned mythology and the role that mythology has within this narrative. And of course, I would be very curious to hear more about that particular thing. I mean, how you sort of handle the longer history of certain tropes. Because some of them can also be treated through metaphors in terms which are very similar to what you have been describing. And the other point, which kind of, again, ranked me in the sort of reception bell, is the geological time. And I was thinking that in classical reception studies, there are some recent-ish contributions, and I think in particular of Shane Butler's works. He has a book entitled Deep Classics, where he tries to apply the kind of geological metaphors to the study of classical reception, trying to come up with a model more interesting to talk about the permanence of things from classical antiquity into the following centuries. So this side of the question would be whether you have any thoughts about maybe sort of intersections with these ongoing conversations in other fields which seem distant, but actually I think there's so much in common here.
Thank you so much for framing it in that way. I actually had a slide. I'm glad you asked. So here is some of my favorite guys, basically, guys and gals, who come up, particularly in Ovid. But yeah, so for example, he didn't really make it into my essay on the lithic Montaigne, but in that chapter he uses the Caucasian mountains as an example of a great kind of lithic body that we think of as permanent and fixed and sort of stony in that sort of commonplace sense, but which in fact are only just subject to a slower kind of flux that we can't see at the human scale. And I was thinking, why has he picked the Caucasian mountains? Why not just a mountain? So I kind of dug around, and one of the things I found was that that's where Prometheus was chained. So there's something there about its, it's kind of mythical heaviness and permanence and earthiness. But it's also got all kinds of significance in terms of Alexander's empire and so on. So it's a boundary in lots of interesting ways. There was more I wanted to say. You can go, let's talk more because it's brilliant. Thank you. I love the idea of deep classics. Geological time in terms of kind of textual strata, if you like. It's an image that's used by editors and scholars of Montaigne in particular because he publishes his book and then he edits it and we can trace the edits. So the idea that it's built in strata has been very popular and has also been unpicked because it kind of simplifies the level of detail at which he works. And it's very, very difficult to account for that in a kind of linear way, which is what makes him so interesting. I didn't know that about deep classics. Something I've kind of thought about more is the sense that our cultural ideas today about ecology, environment, all kinds of issues that we're confronted with now have roots, right? Have long roots and have momentum of a kind. But I haven't thought about them as being stratified or geological in that sense. I think that's something really important to think with. I do think that geological metaphors work really nicely because you have sedimentation, but then you have metamorphosis, you have, you know, shifting and cracking and crisis and rupture. So it's a really rich vein, if you'll forgive me. Just to mention as well, Perillus and the Brazen Bull. Don't know if anyone has come across that. I think it's in Dante, and he's using it and twisting it from Ovid. There's a nice article out there about that, but I forget now if Perillus is the engineer or the tyrant who commissions it, but the tyrant commissions the engineer to build a bull of bronze, and prisoners and torture victims will be placed inside and a fire lit underneath, and so the screams of the victims will sound like the bull is screaming, and so it's kind of bringing this bronze to life again, back to the really dark side of this mineral stuff. And I forget the name of the scholar now who's done a really nice reading of that and how that relates to poetic voice in quite kind of perverse ways. But the moral of the story, if you like, or the twist of the story, is I think that the engineer ends up being put inside his own machine and burns inside it. I think it should have been the tyrant, obviously, rather than the engineer. But again, it's onto that kind of anxiety around what we create and how it might kind of come back to bite us, which doesn't answer deep classics at all. But thanks for pointing that out to me. And I'd love to think about it more. And there's one at the back as well.
Oh, good. All right, first.
Hi, thank you. Hi, thank you. So it's the first I've heard of the concept of the mineralized mind, and I'm wondering if you might talk a bit more about it. What I followed, it seems to me that you're reading the works of Montaigne and Rabelais as sort of evidence of their mineralized minds, if you will, more than their thinking about their work, if you see the difference. In other words, you're not saying that this is the way they're thinking about their creative work, but rather your reading of their work. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Thank you. I am really interested in what they think they're doing. So yeah, maybe I should have made that clearer. So I think that Montaigne, when he's talking about fiction, for me, what he's doing has to stand in some kind of meaningful relationship. Even if he wouldn't categorize what he's doing as fiction, he is still spinning and crafting something, and he uses so many artisanal metaphors. You know, he's a painter, he's sewing something at some point, he's making a pattern and then coming back to it and remodeling it and so on. So it seems to me that he's very conscious of and very ambivalent about the idea that he's a forger of some kind. And so he's constantly sort of anxiously saying, these are bad forgeries and these are maybe legitimate ones. In Rabelais, he's interested in kind of riffing on, for example, patristic ideas of the faithful being the stones of the church, and kind of punning on stony bodies and making babies versus making buildings, and but where he fits in all of that, he does seem to kind of slightly leave himself aside. So that might be a distinction I think I would make. So where I would often align them and say, as I was saying to Philip earlier, in sort of contrast with someone like Ronsard, who I think is really not a mineralized mind, actually, but really he kind of thinks with myth, and he's not so interested in the material as I would understand it. While I would say Rabelais and Montaigne at the other end of the spectrum, if you like, Montaigne is, I think, at least more explicitly concerned with that sort of anxiety about what he's doing. But Rabelais as well is always anticipating the critique and saying in his prologues, don't read me like this, don't read me like that, you know, kind of dancing around it as well. I'm not really sure if I'm quite answering what you're asking, but it's a really important question. Thank you.
This maybe just picks up a little bit of a couple of veins, pun intended, of what's been spoken about recently. But you know, when I think about minerals and mineralizing, I also think about dissolve. And so I just wasn't sure if this was also like kind of a productive, like term or thought at the time, or if we had to, in a sense, wait for dissolve to kind of enter the mix. And so, you know, with in relationship to mineralized thinking, was there also dissolve thinking? And if not, did it come?
Ooh, thank you. Off the top of my mind, I don't know whether the term is there, but I am really interested in solution. And I do think that's a term that Montaigne would use, maybe not quite in the sense that we might be tempted to read it now. Your question makes me think of another image. I think it's still in Du Repentir in the chapter that I mostly talk about in the piece on lithic Montaigne, where he's thinking about mountains and rocks and all sorts. He talks about the social self being like the fine jets of a fountain, the kind of sparkling water, and the real internal self being like the limoneux is the term he uses. So it's back to the mud, right? The kind of the grotty, gunky stuff at the bottom of the fountain. And so, you know, on social media or whatever, you're only ever showing off your sparkly jets and not your muddy self. So I think he has a sense there of, he's not actually thinking about the impressive artificial body of the fountain, but about the kind of guts of it and the way it's never the perfect idea of the fountain. It's always this kind of slightly encrusted and used version. But that's a really nice thing to follow up. Thank you. And it would be good for Palissy as well, right? That he's interested in les eaux plural and salts and all of that. So I'm sure it's in there. I need to really dig into Palissy more. Thank you.
I don't want to take advantage of your generosity, so feel free to ignore my question or just say I'll answer that in the book or whatever. But I'm going to ask it anyway. So at the start you had a slide that was very tantalizing, where you listed the structure of the book that went from armor down to pigment, and then in passing you said, you know, I'm going from the macro to the micro, and so the question is just really about scale, and you mentioned the Extranium book, which is also organized by scale. It's something I've struggled with myself. And, you know, in trying to understand what scale is, you can go to, you know, many places, the Renaissance cosmographers, contemporary geographers. Latour has a thing, I can't remember if it's called against zoom or against zooming or anti-zoom or something like that. Like a lot of people have thought about scale, but what's it, you know, it's always struck me that thinking on scale hasn't advanced that much, and there's always a resistance, or there's always a problem with it as you zoom or whatever you want to call it. So the question, I guess, and again, you don't have to answer it, but what does mineral thinking do for thinking about scale, which is maybe the opposite way of the way that you know, of structuring a book, which is, you know, how can scale help me think about mineral, but does it work both ways? Because I think it probably does, but I don't know what it would be.
This scale thing is something that it's kind of like a wall that I've run into recently. So in the grad class I've been teaching this semester, we've been thinking a lot about zooming in and out, partly with Montaigne, but with others as well. I think I confessed to them that a couple of years ago I got really obsessed with fractal patterns. You keep zooming in and it's just the same. And then the other week we were reading Anna Singh's book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, and she has a real kind of core argument there against scalability, right? In the sense that it's, I'm not going to articulate it very well, but it's a kind of colonial plantation idea, basically, that you multiply at the single unit, the monoculture, and you just expand and expand, and nothing has to change as it gets bigger. So yeah, I think we have to be really wary of that notion of scale, of kind of a real flattening sameness of analogy. But as I was trying to say in my class, I think there's still a real richness in early modern thinking about scale, about microcosm and macrocosm. So again, it's in the kind of attending and attunement to those differences that the tricky questions lie. I think where I've started to think about it is through Montaigne and through how he kind of zooms back and forth between the mountain and a rock, and then the kind of the grain of minerals rubbing up against each other. That was something else I wanted to say to Eugenia, was the bit of sort of trying to think about classical ideas about geology itself, was Montaigne as a reader of Strabo and how the ancients thought about fossils and the mysteries of finding fish fossils up a mountain, and how can you account for that? It's just great that they were perplexed by that, I think. And Strabo has very Montaigne things to say, I think, about it must mean that the land has moved and that the land is weirdly liquid and so on. I'm not quite answering your question, but I really appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, great.
Thanks, Jenny. I've got a question about specifically the Frenchness of all of the mineralized thinking, and maybe it's something for like the introduction of the book. And I was thinking about what was the most useful question of the random things I've written down could be, and I think it's something about what is it about French that allows this kind of mineralized thinking to take place? Can it take place in a different language? So is it something to do with geological history in that particular period? What the writers are dealing with, commonplaces, literature traditions, and what is it about the specificity of the Frenchness of all of this? That, for example, if you'd not decided to do early modern English literature or something, what is it that the French authors are doing that may be different from other traditions?
Thank you. I got that question with the shipwreck project as well. My albatross, yeah. I mean, one very glib answer is that, well, you can probably do this in other languages, but in Montaigne there's a kind of underlying pun on Pierre, which was his father's name, and he inherited his kidney stones from Pierre, and so on. So there's a kind of Freudian reading you can do of Montaigne's kidney stones, which people have done, and which is great. And Rabelais too is interested in playing around with Peter, which, as I say, that's not a French specific pun, right? I think in an earlier stage of this project, where it was more squarely a kind of landscape project, I would have said, and again, this isn't something that's unique in France, but that the Civil War's context makes weird things happen with landscape and in poetry. So that might be part of it, the kind of violence of the Civil Wars, but the specific violence of the Civil Wars. And I'm now looking around for Sophia, who I was talking about this with earlier, the witnessing, the spectacle of that violence. And so swords are no longer just things like in Husserl's poetry, they really become, swords that people are encountering and living and dying with. But that's not a sufficient answer, I don't think. So yeah, I'll have to keep thinking about it, I think. Part of the story might be the Ovid Moralisé tradition, to be honest. I think I need to grapple with Ovid more, and that's something I'm looking forward to doing, yeah. Did you have an answer, by the way?
No.
Okay.
Never ask a question that you
just in
can
case you can get me off the
Thank you, Jen.
All right, in which case, let's put our hands together. Thank you so much.